In this lecture, we're looking at governmental structures, and we are trying to understand the different frameworks of governance and to get a good sense of how that really translates into real dividends and benefits for the people. And in this particular lecture, then, we're looking at parliamentary system of government. Now, I trust that you've read your textbook on the chapters that we discussed last time, and those chapters should give you a good understanding of the parliamentary system of government within the framework of the overall idea and concept of governance. So in this lecture, then, we are looking at the role of the head of state. We are looking at the role of the head of government. We want to understand the difference between the two offices, and have a good sense of how they interact and intersect, as well as Parliament and their role in the structure of governance. Of course, all of this is based on the people. All right, so you often hear that a country has a head of state and a head of government, and sometimes that could be very confusing for some people, and understandably so, because when you talk about head of state, some people think perhaps this person is the one that is in control, is the one that has the political power. But it's important to understand the role of the head of state and the role of the head of government and how they interact and intersect with Parliament. It says here the parliamentary system of government is one where there is a head of government who is elected into Parliament and chosen as head of government by virtue of party leadership. Now, this is a very important point. Why is it important? Because we need to understand how this person emerges. We need to understand how this person becomes sovereign, becomes the head of government, right? And the process of getting to that point. So usually in the parliamentary system of government, and you have countries around the world practicing this system of government. For example, let's put them here. You have Canada. Canada practices, this is Canada, practices parliamentary system of government. New Zealand, Australia, these are big countries that practice this kind of government, and it's important to understand that structure. They all have prime ministers. Australia has prime minister, Canada has prime minister, New Zealand has prime minister, and many other countries around the world as well, they have prime minister, and most of them practice the parliamentary system of government. And this is important to understand. Now, in the parliamentary system of government, it often means that when parliamentarians are elected into office, they in turn choose the leader, and the leader becomes the prime minister. And usually the party that wins, the leader of the party that wins is the prime minister, becomes the prime minister. Not always the case, but usually that is the case. The leader of the opposition becomes the the opposition leader, of course, and the leader of the winning or the ruling party becomes the prime minister. And that prime minister then becomes the head of government. And this is very important to understand, right? So the prime minister becomes the head of government. Yeah. So here it says, sometimes they are chosen via popular elections. There is usually a head of state who in most cases is appointed by the head of government with no real political power, and is usually a ceremonial or figurehead. Now, this is the critical difference, right? So the power rests here. This is power, right? The power rests here. And this person has just ceremonial powers, attending functions on behalf of the government, tip-cutting ceremonies, and just, figurehead, essentially, with no real political power. And this person then is symbolic, right? So the office of the head of state is symbolic, and it shows that the country is in control of its own destiny, is sovereign, is not being ruled or governed by any outside entities and so forth. That is the indication. So the head of state is a symbolic position that suggests that the country is sovereign, and the country is a republic because it's governing itself, and it has its own rulers coming from the country, etc. And this is the important piece when we talk about the structure of governance within the context of parliamentary system of government, right? So the head of state then is a figurehead. Please take note of this, students. It's a figurehead, right? It's a figurehead, and this is figurehead, and performs just ceremonial functions, represent the government in major events, those sort of things. Does not have real power. The real power rests with the head of government. The head of government is the one in charge of the government that makes policies and laws, sign laws, is the one that supervises the ministers and the government agencies and the parastatals, and all of those things are being controlled by the head of government. And the head of government then reports to Parliament, right? Is accountable to Parliament. And this is very interesting because the ministers are coming from Parliament as well. In the parliamentary system of government, the ministers are from Parliament. So essentially, you have a government where the parliamentarians are also the executive. They also make up the executive branch of government because the ministers are chosen from Parliament and they become ministers, but they do not lose their seat in Parliament. They still represent their people, right? They still have the representative function of the people. At the same time, they are the executive as well, because they are the ministers of health and education and transportation and the works, the ministers of infrastructure and so forth, etc. And this is a very interesting system of government. And you may ask the question then, students, where is the accountability? If the executive is the parliament, the executive is made up of parliamentarians, where is the accountability, etc.? And that's a very good question. And they seek to hold themselves accountable. And that's where the opposition comes in. Opposition is not in power in terms of holding executive positions, and they can challenge and they can check the ruling party, and they can hold them to account before the people. So when we talk about parliamentary system of government, we are talking about a system where the head of government comes from Parliament. The head of government is a parliamentarian, and the head of government appoints, in most cases, the head of state. And the head of state then performs ceremonial functions, and is just a figurehead, and it's just symbolic again, within the context of sovereignty. We are sovereign. We are governing ourselves. And here is the example. And here is the head of state, who is head of the state, suggesting that they are self-governing and they are a republic. And so countries around the world have head of state and have head of government. Now, some countries don't have head of state that is from the country itself. They have head of state that is outside the country, for example, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. These countries we've identified. Their head of state is the monarchy. In England, that is the head of state. Right? Whoever is their monarch is the head of state of these countries. So they are not republics, because they don't have head of state that is indigenous. They have a head of state that is not part of the geographical definition of that country. In this case, in the case of Canada and Australia and New Zealand and countries like Jamaica, although Jamaica is seeking to break away from this structure of monarchy and reposing, the functions of the head of state in England, in the monarchy, trying to, get themselves out of it. But nevertheless, these countries practice parliamentary system of government, and their head of state is not indigenous, right? So they are not republics. There are some countries that have head of state, and the head of state is indigenous. India is a good example. India has a prime minister, but it also has a head of state who is an Indian, indigenous person. All right, so it's important to understand this structure and this governmental framework, and this is one of many frameworks you will find around the world when we talk about structures of how countries are governed. The parliamentarian system of government is one where the head of government is elected into parliament and chosen as head of government by virtue of party leadership, right? So because this person is the leader of the party, they become the prime minister. By becoming the prime minister, they are the head of government, not the head of state. They are the head of government, right? So sometimes they are chosen via popular elections. There's usually a head of state who, in most cases, is appointed by the government, right? So the head of government usually appoints the head of state. Sometimes the head of state comes through other means. Perhaps sometimes the parliament approves. Sometimes parliament doesn't approve. Sometimes they are elected. In very rare cases, they are elected, but most times they are appointed into that position. All right, so there's usually a head of state who is, in most cases, is appointed by the head of government with no real political powers and is a ceremonial or figurehead. symbolic of sovereignty. And this is one of the structures of governance. And with this particular framework, then we begin to understand the differences between the head of state and the head of government and the functions of each office. Again, usually the head of government doesn't have much political power. This person has influence, most likely, but doesn't have political power. Sometimes goes to open congressional sessions, parliamentary sessions, just figurehead and ceremonial duties. Those are usually the functions of the head of state. The head of government is the one with the real power and the reports to parliament. And in the parliamentary system of government, you will find that the executive and the parliament are pretty much the same, because the executive members are coming from parliament, and they don't lose their seat when they do that. They continue to represent the people and at the same time make policies and introduce laws to govern the country. That is the parliamentary system of government.